And there we are, live with Mr. Greg Schmaus from 4D Healing. Thank you, buddy, for making some time to come on. It's been a while. It's good to catch up with you.
Yeah, man, it's good to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So um, as I've been watching you from afar since you moved from here, it's been nice to see your ascension. I guess I don't know if that's a right word to call it, but your growth. Let's put it that way. From when you were here, you had a very good junior career. You were college scholarship, were playing golf, and then got out of that and for a while, I don't think you really were sure what you wanted to do. And then you got into the holistic side and the Czech Institute and all those things. So we have a lot to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I want to touch on with the golf connection. You were a very very good junior golfer, and ended up coming to the IJGA, which is where we met when you were at school here. So can you just talk about that part of your life, and we'll begin there on the Schmaus story,
Well,
and we'll just move into all the way through.
yeah, I'll get into that. But the first thing I want to share is that you were a huge part of my journey in terms of transitioning from my golf career into the work that I'm doing now in the Czech stuff. You were actually my first introduction to Paul Chek.
Hmm.
So I owe you a lot in terms of kind of opening the door for me into kind of what I consider to be, a sense of purpose or mission kind of in my life. So first off is thank you for that.
Happy to.
And yeah, so my junior golf career started up in the Northeast. I started competing, I would say around age 13 is when I think I played my first junior golf tournament. And when I was up here, there was another junior golfer locally, Morgan Hoffman, who was really an incredible talent and someone I started following like pretty closely because there was just like this knowing that like this kid's going to do something really really good and will probably make it to the tour. And he went down to Hilton Head to the International Junior Golf Academy, and I eventually kind of like followed in a similar path. And that's when I would say 16 was when I moved down to South Carolina and went to the IJGA. And that was a really great experience in terms of living on my own, taking care of myself, managing my schoolwork, my practice, my training and tournament competition. And that really set the stage for a lot of growth and maturity, leaving home at very much an early age. And around that time was when I really felt like I
Hey,
wanted to
Greg,
specialize. Yeah.
hang on one second. Something happened. We got to start over. I don't know if something happened on my end that it cut out, and now when I'm looking at the timestamp, it's like 25 seconds in, so it cut out. I think the beginning.
Okay. It's
So
it's
let me.
going on my end.
What's the timer say?
3 minutes 37 seconds.
All right. Well, it might have cut out my end. Fuck.
Hmm.
Let me. If I leave this, can you leave it and then log back in, and we'll just start from the beginning? It's basically same beginning.
Sure.
Is that a problem? Okay. Sorry
No,
about that. This is
no,
it's
that's
got
all
me all
good.
screwed up. Okay. Cool.
So you want me to click leave?
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna. I don't know anything else to do,
Okay.
and I don't know if it kept it. So let me click that. Working?
Yep.
Okay. I don't know. I tried to. There is a very subtle echo on my end, and I tried to replug my USB in, and then it just went completely blank.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that screwed it up, but fuck, sorry about that.
So we good on your end now?
I think so. Let me
Cool.
just. So we'll just. I'll do the hey, thanks for coming on, etc., and
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
just go from there. Okay. Very excited to have on a very good friend of mine. I watched his career and life path since he for about what 15 years, Greg.
Yeah.
Greg Schmaus from 4D Healing. Very happy to have him on to talk about his junior golf career, collegiate golf career, and just life in general, and a lot of things about holistic healing and the Chek Institute. So, thanks for carving out some time, buddy.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Anytime I can connect with you.
So before we had the tech issue, we were talking about. I appreciate you giving me. Thank you for kind of introducing you to the Chek Institute and all the cool
Mm-hmm.
things that they do. I crazy enough, as you know, we were all into working out and training back then. All went to the same gym. We played a lot of golf together, and but even before that, I was, had been training because when I played professional golf and was very interested in that stuff. Because largely because when I was a kid, when I was in high school, I was 6'4", 190 pounds. I was a decent basketball player and played a lot of golf, and I could never gain any muscle mass. So of course, when I got older, it became a obsession. And I was watching one night on there was I believe it was called Art of the Athlete, was a TV show that Gabrielle Reese was the hostess on, and they would go with
Mm-hmm.
different athletes. The Machados were on there, the jujitsu guys, and Ryan Moore, the golfer, was on there, and she had Laird Hamilton, obviously her husband, one night,
Mm-hmm.
and they were talking about his routine and what he does as training. And she said, "What about your diet?" And he said, "Well, whatever Mr. Chek tells me to do is what I do."
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, I thought I knew quite a bit of trainers and stuff about that. So I get on a computer and Google Chek, Paul Chek, and I just like, holy shit, this stuff is amazing.
Yeah.
So that was my introduction to it. And then I met Justin, and you got involved in that. And but that
Mm-hmm.
was to back up even further from where we were a little bit earlier. That was how I got into that stuff. And you've obviously taken it well past what anything I ever did. Um, so I guess let's just kind of talk there. And you had mentioned how you got into junior golf, and Morgan Hoffman was from your area as well.
Yeah. So I would say Morgan was my introduction to junior golf in the sense of where I was being directed. So I started playing a lot of local events. Then I started playing some of the local IJGT events, which was the tour for the golf academy
Mm-hmm.
in Hilton Head. And once Morgan went to the school, went to the academy, and a few other local guys did, I kind of had a sense that that was going to be my next step. So I headed down to Hilton Head my junior year of high school. So I spent 2 years of high school down there, living down there, going to school, training, working with some of the coaches down there, and it was a very positive experience. My golf game really excelled tremendously, but also I think as a person moving out at a young age, I really learned how to take care of myself. I learned how to manage my time and manage my diet and exercise. And so it was kind of like my first initiation into kind of real like self responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And my my junior golf career actually really blossomed a little bit later on in my senior year, where I started shooting some pretty low scores early on in my senior year. So I had actually committed pretty early on to a small school in Texas. And then after I committed, I started playing really, really well. I started shooting some rounds in the mid 60s and kind of placing really high in some pretty big events. And eventually I ended up backing out of that verbal commitment, which is kind of frowned upon, but it's something that I had to do. Just because the opportunities that presented themselves as a result of where how I was playing, it really opened a lot of doors. And eventually I signed with the University of Houston. And the University of Houston was a really cool program to be a part of because of how much history there is there. A lot of people don't know that the University of Houston actually has more national championships than any other college in the United States in terms of like Division One, like NCAA championships, and so many like amazing players like Fuzzy Zeller and Fred Couples and Jim Nance being from U
Mm-hmm.
of H, and kind of a lot of like the kind of old timers that like we all kind of looked up to and are now on the scene, usually as like reporters or television cast stars or Nick Faldo. I think Nick Faldo was one of them from the University of Houston.
Yeah, I think Monty
Um,
went there for a year, didn't he?
I think
Montgomery.
so. Yeah, yeah. Steve Elkington.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to meet a lot of those guys and hang out with them a little bit. So my time in Houston was actually cut a little bit short because of an injury that I had and a surgery that I ended up going in for. And eventually I left Houston and moved back to Hilton Head, which is when you and I connected. And I just started playing more amateur golf. I started playing as an amateur on some of the mini tours, some of like the Hooters tour events and some of the Carolina tours. So I actually started to expose myself to the professional golf world well before I finished college. I kind of decided to go that route and kind of play those events as an amateur rather than looking for another college team to play on. Which I think was really good for me because looking back, professional golf was not really in my cards.
Mm-hmm.
And playing the mini tours while I was still in college was a really nice rude awakening as to how good these guys really are. And that although I was good at a junior, amateur, and collegiate level, there was no way I was going to play out there with those guys like at the highest level. So I actually feel like very fortunate that I came to that realization pretty early on. And I think that saved me a lot of time, energy, and money where,
Mm-hmm.
I could have, gone out there and kind of had the fantasy of playing on the PGA Tour. But the truth is, I don't think I was ever good enough. Like I can say that with no shame, with no like self judgment. Like I think there's value in thinking that we could do anything and we can achieve anything, but I think there's also value in the humility of if I compare myself to like guys I grew up with, like the Morgan Hoffmans and the Jordan Spieths and the Justin Thomases, like these are guys I grew up with. There was no way in hell I was going to compete against those guys. Like I really didn't have the talent. And I found no matter how hard I worked, I just didn't really have the game for the highest level.
Were you somewhat at their level in the junior golf before you got to the academy, and then maybe even at the academy for a little while, and then where did they seem to accelerate or separate themselves from you?
Um, I was able to compete with them for a period of time, but what I noticed with those guys is they had that ability to go really low.
Mm-hmm.
Like those guys could shoot 62 at the age of 16, 17 years old. Now, when I was 17 years old, I had shot some rounds in the mid 60s, like 65, 66, 67. And those were the best rounds of golf I ever played. Like, but looking back, there was no way I was shooting 61 and 62. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it was almost like I could compete with them, but they also had this gear that was different. And I also wonder how much of it is more a reflection of self belief than anything. Like, I think many of us, we kind of have this form of self sabotage that we're actually afraid of going that low. We're actually afraid of really succeeding at the highest level. And I think there was some of that in me. I think one of the things that really held me back from competing at the highest level was probably a lot of fear. There was still a lot of fear inside of me that I hadn't really worked through yet. Um, and those guys, they just played with no fear. They really like played fearlessly and were able to just go lower and lower and lower and just keep the foot on the gas pedal. And
Yeah,
there was
it
a part of
is
me that was afraid of that for some reason.
to use one of the Czech analogies is, and very important, and I hope we get into this in a little bit, but everybody's into working out, right? But Paul
Mm-hmm.
talks a lot about working in.
Mm-hmm.
And as I look back on what I see a lot of golfers do, and I'm guilty of it as well, when I made the decision to pursue professional golf, is you work so hard at your game and your swing, or you're out on the range, you're beating balls, or you're going to play. And I don't think enough people take step back and, um, well, let me put it a different way. When someone is a kid and they're playing, they obviously go to an instructor, a coach, and they do work on mechanics. That's maybe how they get better. But what kids develop early on, which is I think the working in part that Paul refers to, at least if I can relate it to a golf sense, is if you go to sometimes a tournament, or what was very prevalent at the IJGA, and I think most of the academies, is kids have free time. They'll go out to the chipping green or the putting green or the range, and they'll, hey, who can hit it around this tree and to this flag, 30-yard draw or a
Mm-hmm.
40-yard slice, or who can hit this flop shot uh, over this and around this, and just come up with some super creative ways. But in that environment, because everybody seems to be friends or they wouldn't be hanging out together, you develop a somewhat of a sense of trust, and your brain shuts off. And the kids who develop the ability to do that with their brain off and not take it step by step on, I have to take my grip this way or that way, I see that as a very big undeveloped thing in people who are exceptional golfers or athletes or fill in the blank, and people who rise above that. They're I would call it more well-rounded, more skill developed in the, some people would call it the subconscious, but doing so without having any conscious thought at all. And
Mm-hmm.
myself, when you say that the fear of shooting really low, I think turning the brain off and trusting yourself that it can guide it to what it needs to be. I think kids develop that. Um, and as we get older, sometimes it's hard to develop that because we don't want to let go of our comfort level or what we're good at. It's uh, very hard sometimes to let go and admit, as you did earlier, that maybe you're not good enough at this, but you can get better.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Or I'm just talking in circles.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And what comes to mind for me is creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
you
very
kind
much
of
so.
have the left brain and the right brain, and the left brain being kind of like the rational, logical, linear um, kind of engineer type kind of mentality, but the right brain is the artist. And I think a lot of those great players have this. I think Tiger is probably one of the greatest combinations of the two. Like
Yeah.
Tiger will work on the range as an engineer in the left brain, but then once he gets on the first tee, the artist kicks on, and now it's just creating shots. And I think there were a lot of times where I got too stuck in engineer mode trying to manufacture something technically,
Mm-hmm.
where I didn't allow kind of like, you could say, like the inner genius that exists within all of us to actually come through. Like there was probably fear and inhibition of allowing that part of me to express itself on the golf course. Where a lot of the guys that we're talking about, they feel more comfortable with that. They feel more at home with that. And you could explore a million reasons why. Um, but I think you said it perfectly. I think that's really what differentiates kind of those that are, playing out there for a living now, and those that may not have really kind of stepped it up to that level of play.
Yeah, or if they do step it up, that they have to maybe put it in overdrive because that segment of their themselves or their game or whatever portion has to be put into an overdrive, and they can't sustain it for as long a period.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they do get there, then I mean they're running in the hot, and then they cool off, and it's like, how do you get back to that level? I used to explain playing at that level, um, like driving a Formula One car versus just idling through your neighborhood. If you're
Mm-hmm.
idling through your neighborhood as a 36 handicap and you run over a half inch or 1 inch twig, you're going to break the twig. It's not really going to do much. But if you're in a Formula One car and you hit a 1 inch twig or stick on a racetrack, you're dead.
Yeah.
Um, so it's that's the best analogy I could ever come up with looking back at playing at a very high level. But I think my own career is missing that. And as I forget what book Anders Ericsson, I think, was the one. I can't remember the title of it. Um, but he talks about, I think it was one of the classic, was it Mozart or Beethoven? Maybe Mozart, where his dad was a music teacher and his sister was something like 3 or 4 years older. So when he was 2, he was listening in his crib or his cradle or wherever he was to his dad teaching his sister all
Mm-hmm.
the music and pitch and everything else. So that by the time he was 6 years old and he had perfect pitch, everyone thought he was just a born genius. It's like, well, he just spent his entire early childhood development listening to what perfect pitch is
Mm-hmm.
while he was in the safety and comfort of his family and his home. So I think that plays a big role in it as well.
Yeah. I think there's so many variables in terms of childhood development that
Mm-hmm.
really shows up on the golf course. Like things like obviously there's genetic components, but even for me, like one of my kind of core wounds as a child was kind of being the invisible child who like never wanted to be in the spotlight, never really spoke very much, and kind of almost liked the invisibility because it felt safe. And I think there was a part of me that knew on a subconscious level that if I really excel at this, more people are going to start coming and watching me. And there's a part of me that actually, as much as I want to win this golf tournament, there's a part of me that probably also doesn't want that. So
Mm-hmm.
until I actually like healed that part of me, there was going to be some level of self sabotage on the golf course because more and more success would bring more and more attention to the wounded parts of me that are not really ready for that. So I think that's one element. Also, I very much had this kind of like perfectionist mindset as well, which I think the inner perfectionist is one that gets in the way of our like highest potential. And I remember practicing like 10, 12 hours a day and having like roommates that like went to the beach that day. And then we would go out and play a tournament and they would beat me. And there was a part of me that's just like, what the hell? Like I put the work in, like, aren't I deserving of, X, Y, and Z
Yeah.
results? And the truth is, I wrote about this in a newsletter recently, is the difference between worthiness and deserving. A lot of times like we have this mindset, and this starts as a child, where we do something good and we think we're deserving of a reward, and then we do something bad and we think we're deserving of a punishment. So now we're an adult. What happens if we do something good and we don't get the reward? We actually feel like victimized. Or
Mm-hmm.
what happens if we get something that we don't want and we can't find anything that we did to deserve that negative thing? We feel victimized. So all of a sudden, looking back, I realized that I was in this whole kind of like mathematical equation of what I thought I deserved, but actually didn't feel worthy of. Where the kid, like hanging out on the beach, like that's not even in his conscious. He feels worthy of a result. That's why he's hanging out on the beach. And he's going to go out the next day and just like play freely. Where I put 12 hours of work in and I go out the next day and I just get in my own way. Right? So there is this also ability to open yourself up to success and feel worthy of it rather than deserving of it. And when you can let go of like this equation of if I put this amount of work in, then I deserve this amount of results. And if I don't, then I don't deserve it. Like that whole kind of linear mindset really gets in the way of allowing your performance to just flow.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's so many of those little variables that I'm now aware of looking back that I wasn't consciously aware of at the time.
Yeah, I had the same issue with trying to be perfect, and even Mike Harmon when he came on, he was my first guest, and we were talking about that prior because he did have his tour card for a short time back in the
Hmm.
early '80s, I believe it was. But and I told him, he said, Why do you think you didn't make it?" He said, "You had the game, you had everything you needed." And I said, "Well, I look, it took me a long time to figure it out, and I'll tell you why in a second. But I said I realized that my desire to be perfect was inhibiting my ability to progress."
Yeah.
And I never realized that. And until one night I was watching the Tony Robbins "I'm Not Your Guru" documentary,
Uh-huh.
and he he asked, and because I Tony's been around a long time, and mostly through since I was a teenager, and I'm sitting here, and Tim Ferriss had him on a number of times. I'm like, okay, I'll listen to this guy because I got a 4 hour drive, and he's got to be somewhat decent because he's been around so long. And Ferriss has him on, so I'm listening to him, and I watched the documentary, and there was a part in one of them where he asked somebody, so I'm going to ask you two questions, and it's going to tell me a lot of what I need to know. He said, "I know you love both of your parents, but uh, which, which of them did you seek their attention more?"
Hmm.
And he said, "You'll know the answer immediately. You don't even have to think about it." And then his follow up was, "What did you have to do, or who did you have to be to warrant or garner that attention, at least in your own
Hmm.
mind?" And for me, like the answer came immediately, that it was my dad, and I had to be perfect. Not my
Hmm.
dad has told me many times when I was younger that he would apologize. I tried to make you do things too right, and I remember one time in fourth grade, I was afraid to go home because I got a C in
Hmm.
science, and I was just deathly afraid that he was going to tear into me. And I mean, looking back, and now you connect the dots, it's like, holy shit. And for years when I was in my 20s, and he would say he apologized for pushing hard and trying to make me do things too perfect, and I never understood what he said or what he was talking about. But then finally, when I look back on why I didn't make it, given the skill set I had and ability, I mean that to me was massive. And to this day, when things don't go right with the podcast, like the tech issue that popped up earlier, and I have to remind myself, you don't have to, it's not going to be perfect. We're human beings, and we live in a
Hmm.
world that things just don't flow perfectly. It's okay to make mistakes. That's how you're going to gain some wisdom.
Hmm.
But or instincts. You're not just born with all the instincts you need. You got to throw yourself out there and make mistakes. You learn, and you're going to develop your instincts. So that for me was a big eye opening. I guess when I heard that, whether it was on that show or that TV program, whatever it was, to me it was like an epiphany,
Yeah.
like things open wide up. I'm like, holy shit.
Yeah. Well,
But I'm with you on the practicing and the perfectionism. 'Cause nowadays, maybe it's because I learned that and brain wiring changes, but I don't like to practice unless I have something like,
hmm.
like we were talking earlier, we play about once a week, and I don't really know my distances.
Hmm.
So I'll go out and with a meter and or a rangefinder and try to find out how far I hit it. But that's about the extent of my practice. I much more enjoy playing now. The
Hmm.
camaraderie, being outside, all the things that you start playing golf for in the beginning.
Hmm. Yeah, I had a very similar experience with my dad, and I distinctly remember, it was very interesting. I always chose a completely opposite path to my father. Like he was always very academic, like Ivy League, like all that kind of stuff, and I was
Mm-hmm.
always athletics. So totally opposite path. Then after golf, my dad's a Western medicine physician, and I chose holistic health. Like always choosing like the complete opposite path. And there's obviously this child in you that just wants his approval, but like never seems to get it. And I remember, and this is very interesting. I remember playing golf tournaments as a junior, and my dad would travel with me to some of them. My mom would travel to others. And my mom would always walk all 18 holes no matter what. But my dad would walk, and if I started playing poorly, he would leave. And as a child, I took that as a rejection, or I took that as like an abandonment of like, oh, if I don't perform at a certain level, my dad leaves.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually a form of trauma. And the truth is that when I inquired about it later on, and I asked him, like, hey, why did you leave when I started not playing well? He said, well, I didn't think you would want me there if you weren't playing well. Like, I thought that you would probably want me to walk away if you weren't really performing the way you want to. So he was actually trying to be empathetic and trying to do what he thought I wanted him to do, when in fact I took it as a rejection. So this is why, like, if you study Gabor Mate's work on trauma
Yeah,
and addiction,
it's amazing.
he talks about that all traumas are not what happened to you, but how you perceived it,
Hmm.
right? Like, he works with people with trauma and addiction, and he asks them, how did you feel? And they say, I felt abandoned. And he goes, that's not a feeling, that's a perception. How did you feel? And they say, I felt rejected. That's not a feeling, that's a perception. So what you realize is so much of our pain and trauma and a lot of our programming that got developed is a result of perceptions of what happens, which very often are not really a true reflection of what actually happens. And that kind of that was a big shift for me when I started to realize that once I inquired the truth about why he actually walked away, it totally reframes my need to be a perfectionist. Because I thought I had to play perfectly in order for my dad to hang around.
Hmm.
But that's not actually the case at all. I could have just said, "Hey, I'd love for you to watch the whole rounds, and you don't have to leave because you think I'm going to be uncomfortable if I'm not playing well." There's so much in the psyche that is actually going on within an athlete. And I've worked with so many young adults who were competitive athletes that struggle with a lot of anxiety and depression and perfectionism and obsessive compulsive disorder and all kinds of stuff. And you realize that there's actually a lot of like subtle traumas during their competitive journey as an athlete that actually sets the stage for a lot of the things that they end up struggling with. um, but in reality, all of those traumas are really based on how we're perceiving, not actually what's happening.
Yeah, I'm a huge Gabor fan. I remember the first time I heard him was on Tim Ferriss' show, and I
Mm-hmm.
think he just did another round on there, and he was on Rogan. And
Yeah.
I just listened to that whole one the other day, and I also, being a Jordan Peterson fan as well. Jordan talks about as young kids before you hit adolescence, you have a very deep desire to get acknowledgement or the approval of your parents.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the number one thing that you strive for. And then
Mm-hmm.
as you get in adolescence and you get into your groups and your friends, it segues from the parents to your friend group, or at least according to some of the literature that he's had.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm, that is very interesting as I'm learning more about those things, because
Yeah.
to me it's like a problem that hasn't been fixed yet. But I don't think, I mean, the psyche goes so deep that you could get down some rabbit holes in how that stuff works. So I have accepted, like, okay, I have at least have an understanding of where that perfectionism or hiccup for me came from. and
Mm-hmm.
and now the next step is, okay, putting the things into place to become better at it.
Mm-hmm.
But and understanding it as you listen to other people talk about it, it opens up the door to learn more about it, at least for
Mm-hmm.
myself. And as we're talking about, for a listener out there, you might be saying, why are you guys going off on psychologists and childhood development? It's like, okay, well, what develops in a child, and especially as they're playing junior golf, and you have helicopter parents nowadays, and there's even a harder push for it. And I think it's a bigger issue now than when you were playing. And I mean, I was playing junior golf, 15, 20 years before you were playing. So it's the parent child dynamic, and the development of an athlete from a young age, and as they progress, and then maybe some of the reasons that they don't make it, or they don't make it at least to the level that they should have, be it they don't play pro golf, or they don't get to the Corn Ferry, they don't get to the PJ Tour, they don't win 20 times on the tour, they don't win a major, whatever the level is. There is that part of them that is doing something for a reason that is not working to their benefit, yet they think it is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, there's so much. The truth is that the body does not move or operate without a mind. The mind is what's driving, like Paul says, like matter can't arrange itself.
Hmm.
Like matter needs mind or consciousness to arrange itself or inform the body what to do. So if you don't understand the program that's running in the mind, you're never really going to understand why the body's behaving the way it is.
And I think to even differentiate that, to maybe explain to somebody, and knowing some of the Czech information, is that there is a difference between the mind and the brain,
Mm-hmm.
right? So as you mentioned, body, there would be that mind to brain to body connection. Would you say?
Yes. So you could say the brain is the hardware, the mind is the software. So if
Hmm.
you have a computer, you have all the files on the computer, but if you break open the computer, you're not going to tangibly find the files. You're not going to find the programs in the computer, the hardware itself. So you could say the hardware is the brain and all the files and programs on the computer would be the mind.
Right. That's a very good way to explain it.
Yeah.
Before we get too intense let's back up a little bit onto.
Sure.
I got to ask you about. I remember you telling me some of the stories when you were at Houston,
Yeah.
about going to some of the parties, in particular TA3's house. Uh, that he had some pretty cool and interesting parties.
He had some
Tommy
wild
Arnold.
parties, but yeah, that was more in the Dallas area, I think.
Okay.
I think he was in the Dallas area, but yeah, he would throw some crazy parties during the Byron Nelson, I think.
Yeah, it was in Dallas.
During the Byron Nelson, and I had some buddies that would attend those. And I mean, like the spreads that he had, I mean, he had, you know, the women and the strippers, and he had the whole thing, all
I
of it,
remember the
anything you could imagine.
the sushi table.
The
Wasn't there
sushi table.
a girl? Well, how should we put it on a family show like this? Not even scantily clad, or
Mm-hmm.
her cladness was in sushi
Mm-hmm.
all over her body,
Yes.
imitating some haberdash.
Yes.
Is that a politically correct way to say it?
Yes. Yeah. So there are definitely some epic stories about some of the parties he threw during the Byron Nelson.
So let's jump back for so after you played the golf, you got a very eye-opening experience on professional golf early on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so talk about where you went from there. So you were, to me, you were all, you were searching for something to put yourself into. That might be a crude way to say it, but that's the best way I can come up with right now. Not a negative
Yeah.
connotation at all.
Yeah.
But you were it's not that you were lost, because you weren't. You were looking for something to that direction that you wanted to go. So kind of talk about that time, and then what led you ultimately into the Czech practice and working with Paul, and that whole thing.
So, like we shared with when we started, a lot of it was your introduction, where you brought me to Justin, who is a Czech practitioner in Charleston, while I was
Hmm.
still playing and competing. So while I was still in school, playing a lot of tournaments, practicing, training, I was introduced to the Czech system just by Justin being our trainer
Hmm.
and doing the assessments and writing the exercise programs. And as soon as you introduced me to that, there was something inside of me that like lit up. I'm like, this stuff is really cool. And I started to really develop more of a passion for exercise, weight training, the corrective exercise, the nutrition, and just kind of that whole world. And what I started doing was, while I was still in classes, I would, instead of bringing my textbook, I would bring certain like checkbooks. So while I was in college, I was just blowing off what the curriculum was and just studying what I wanted to study, because that's always how I've been. I'm only going to do something if I'm really passionate about it and interested. So I started studying some of that while I was still in school and still competing. So I hadn't yet made like the full transition into that work. Um, but there was something inside of me that was like slowly itching towards that line of work and kind of like slowly away from I'm going to play professional golf. So it was a very slow transition where I was still playing and competing and still playing some good golf, but there was something inside of me that was really drawn to the corrective exercise, the nutrition, um, the assessment work, and a lot of the stuff that you and Justin introduced me to. And then eventually, once I graduated school and I knew I wasn't going to turn pro, that's when I moved to Charleston, and Justin mentored me for a good 2 to 2.5 years, I think it was. So I
Mm-hmm.
worked in the studio with him and saw my own clients, and he would kind of oversee the work I was doing. And that's when I started the whole Chek education system. So it was a very slow, steady progression into kind of slowly moving away from golf over time and slowly kind of stepping into the Chek work. And most of it really started on like the personal training side. So much more on like the physical side. So doing assessments, writing programs, training people, doing some like corrective work,
Mm-hmm.
working with some people with some sort of like chronic pain. Um, so that was kind of like the steady transition for me.
The I had the first book of Paul's I got was his golf biomechanics book,
Mm-hmm.
and now that I mean with so much out, I mean compared to back then, and that was what going back to like 2006, 7, 8. So
Mm-hmm.
we've had was it 14 to 16 years of technology and advancements in everything in the world. Um, and now I mean you have like Sasha McKenzie, the golf biomechanist, and Mike Adams does a lot with and Phil Cheatham, and and all these guys, Michael Jacobs, who's up in New York, so how would you classify, or where would you put Paul's book in relationship to what the modern golf biomechanists are talking about, or is it just it's biomechanics in golf, but it's more the training side and a
Well,
differentiation from let's say someone swinging a club.
what I love about Paul's system is he doesn't jump right to sports specific training. Sports specific training is, you could say, like the fourth phase of what you need to take someone through before they get to that point. So Paul always starts with restoring flexibility and postural balance. That would be like
Mm-hmm.
step one. Step two would be restoring stability and core function. Then step three would be developing basic strength using the primal patterns. And then step four would be more sports specific training. I think most of the training systems that are out there skip steps and kind of go right to the sports specific training, no matter what individual is participating in that. Where I think Paul is one of the very few systems that really knows how to assess an individual
Mm-hmm.
and really understand what needs to be corrected and brought into balance first. And the analogy that Paul uses that I always like, that's very simple, is we all have muscle imbalances, we all have postural distortions, and we're kind of like a bike in which the wheels are running crooked, they're out of balance. Like you have these spokes on the wheel that are too tight, you have these spokes on the wheel that are too loose. And if you just ride the bike, you're going to further the imbalance. You're going to be driving crooked, and you're going to eventually, the bike's going to break down. So Paul always starts with assessing, like, okay, what spokes are loose that need strengthening? What spokes are tight that need stretching? And we first need to bring the bike into balance before we can actually ride it with any level of intensity. Where
Mm-hmm.
I think most systems don't go through that corrective process first and set a foundation of balance. And where people get into trouble, and rehabbed a lot of these types of athletes, especially golfers, is they go right into the strength training and the sport specific training, and they put a lot of the stress on their body. But when you put stress on an imbalanced body, you further facilitate the imbalance. So I think there's very few systems that actually take you through that process first.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I had done a number of them before I connected with Justin, and that came
Mm-hmm.
out of just a need to uh, frustration and continual pain that I was in, and I had done the other things, and I had done them extremely religiously and wasn't getting the result. And I remember the day that I talked to Justin was on the driving range at Indigo Run,
Mm-hmm.
and I told him, I've been following this for years. I've got Paul's books, and I've got this, and I've been doing his training and his golf book. And he goes, well, which exercise in the book and stretches are you doing? I was like, all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, yeah, you probably don't need all of them. It's good that you're
Yeah.
trying. But I mean, my training with stretching and lifting was taking 2.5 hours a day. And I mean, back then I had the time. The economy was in the shitter, and wasn't doing a whole lot. But
And if you
that's
think
when I got
about it,
connected to him.
if I just kind of chime in for a sec,
Sure.
if you think about, if you take that wheel where some of the spokes are too tight and some of the spokes are too loose, doing all the stretching would be like loosening all the spokes.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's not actually balancing the wheel. Where doing all of the exercises would be like tightening all of the spokes. That's not balancing the wheel either. So that's why, Paul has the saying, if you're not assessing, you're guessing.
Right.
And that's unfortunately where a lot of training programs are. They're really guesses. It's kind of like Russian roulette. Like you're not really um, you're not really going about it intelligently. And what's also nice about Paul's system is he's developed calipers to actually measure these things.
Mm-hmm.
So for a lot of the people who kind of are more of the left brain, to be able to quantify this stuff is really important for a lot of people. So, and it's also, it also helps you track progress. For example, if someone has like an increased lordosis in their spine and like this anterior pelvic tilt, and say their pelvis is 17 degrees anteriorly tilted and their lumbar spine has 45 degrees of curvature, and you want to reduce all of that, now you can actually write someone an exercise and stretching program, and then 6 weeks later you can retest it and see if it actually made a difference. So that's where also that system is really helpful, is you can actually quantify and objectively measure these things.
And that is huge because like you said, otherwise you're just, I call it throwing darts in the dark. You're
Mm-hmm.
just trying to see what sticks. And that was one of the reasons that I like the Czech system so much. Is he got, obviously he's very smart, he's very well read, and he's very experienced, but he got down to the root causes of why things were the way they were.
Mm-hmm.
um, and that was in large part, I mean, I had created the the tagline of my golf instruction was a hole-in-one approach, what actually ended up being the same thing, the subtitle of his book,
Mm-hmm.
whole being WHOLE, because I had, as you know, I'd gotten into a lot of different aspects of golf and instruction, and
Mm-hmm.
what are the root causes, not just, okay, well, you're getting stuck underneath, or you're coming over it, or you're doing this, like, okay, well, learning a lot of the Czech stuff and the body things, it's like, okay, well, there's physical limitations that cause that. Then I got into the club fitting side, and then, okay, there's clubs things that cause or can cause and exacerbate physical issues, or they can lead to physical issues, and
Mm-hmm.
it was never ending, which was kind of cool. It made it very interesting, so the learning didn't get stagnant.
Yeah.
But I think in today's world, as I see Paul's program growing, is people gravitating towards him. It's like there's so much information out there that we're bombarded with on a regular basis, but he's able to decipher per individual. It's like, okay, you need this, this, and this in this recipe, right? And you might have a twin, and they might have went through exactly the same life you did, and they might need this, this, and this, but in a different recipe, because
Mm-hmm.
theirs would screw you up and yours would screw their up, like almost like having poison.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating for me to watch some of his things where someone that's that good at all the different things that he does can make the determination and the judgment on what someone's wrong and then exactly what they need. And I think that that in large part was missing in the golf industry until, let's say, the last couple of years. So we've had this massive amount of data collection with TrackMan, force plates, swing catalyst, KVS, and everything. But it's like, okay, how do you differentiate between what they need for their particular body and system and training and mental aspect, and then what their twin would need, because they're not going to be the same.
Mm-hmm.
We're not wired the same. We're not the same kind of person.
Yeah.
And you went out and you trained under Paul too, didn't you?
Yeah, I was a client of Paul's for about 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we did um, weekly coaching for just about that time. So we would do coaching over Zoom every other week. And then usually about twice a year, I would go out there in person and spend about 2 days together and do more like intensive work. So yeah, I was fortunate enough to have kind of like a little bit of a closer look into that world and have the opportunity to work with him more directly
Mm-hmm.
as a client, not just a student. So, I'm very grateful to have had that experience.
What was some of the things that the differences that you guys would do that would be in person versus say over Zoom?
Um, a lot of it was shamanic medicine
Uh huh.
based, so plant medicine work. Um, a lot of it was treatment work, so like body work, energetic work. We would do some physical work together, but a lot of the in person work was more ceremonial. So we would do a lot of the coaching remotely, and then I would fly out there in person and we would do some plant medicine work. We would do some more kind of like hands on healing, um, body work. We would do some movement, but we didn't do as much on the physical side, just because a lot of the things that I was struggling with was more on the mental, emotional side, which ended up manifesting physically um,
Mm-hmm.
with things like like gut issues and digestive issues, things like that. Um, so that was more of the in-person work, and then when we would work remotely, we would do a lot of obviously working on my nutrition, lifestyle, um, a lot of different kind of like meditations, mindfulness practices, tai chi, qigong, um, diving deep into kind of like the archetypes, really understanding oneself from the lens of archetypes. So a lot of that more like inner healing work,
Mm-hmm.
um, which was amazing because that's a lot of the work I do now. But working with Paul directly, you really get to see a couple things. Number one, you get to see how he sees things. And the way he sees things is from this higher vantage point of seeing the interconnectedness of everything, right? And you could boil that down to something as simple as, let's take a golfer who's struggling with their golf swing, and you notice that they're not rotating properly. And you realize that their core is very weak. And that's the reason that they're unstable and not really able to rotate the way you want them to. And you kind of investigate, okay, like, well, why is their core not functioning properly? Well, the way Paul sees it is, well, their gut's inflamed. Their intestines are inflamed. Well, why are their intestines inflamed? Well, they're eating a lot of processed wheat and sugar.
Mm-hmm.
And then you try and get them off of processed wheat and sugar, and they won't do it because they have a food addiction. And then you look into, well, why are they having a food addiction? Now you arrive at something much deeper. So the truth is, the way Paul sees it from this higher vantage point is, you're not actually going to get that person swing better until you actually heal what's going on inside of them. Because you're not going to get their core functioning properly until the inflammation in their gut comes down, because they're eating better, because they don't need the food addiction anymore to compensate for whatever was going on inside of them. So you realize, like, holy shit, like, to be able to see the interconnectedness of all of those systems, from the golf swing to the core to the gut to the food to the mind and the emotions, like, that's what holistic really means. That's really what it means to look at something holistically. So I was very much exposed to that way of thinking. So it became a great tool and asset of mine, of just being able to see clients and myself and life through that lens. Like Paul always says, I'm here to teach people how to think, not what to think. And that's an example of teaching someone how to think. Also, spending time with Paul the way I have, I learned just as much, if not more, just watching the way he lives than anything he actually taught me directly. And just watching the way that that individual lives from the place of mindfulness, from the place of presence, from the place of real, like, honesty and authenticity, and also watching the sacredness in which Paul operates from, whether it's every time he eats, it's a prayer over the food. Anytime he you know goes into the gym, he's connecting with his body and pausing and asking for guidance to see what his body's needing that day. It's just this very, like, intentional way of living. And when you watch that, you realize how much we engage in parts of our life very mindlessly or very unintentionally. And once you really start emulating that, in which you're really living intentionally, that's how you enter a flow state. That's what a flow state really is. A flow state is a state in which you're very present, mindful, and intentional about what you're doing. And I think that's something we all need to work on, especially right now with the amount of overstimulation and distractions that
Mm-hmm.
we have, like, in our modern kind of technological, like, device oriented world. um so there's so much that I learned just from being in that space with him, and just observing, kind of like a child observes their parents and kind of picks up on things that they're not actually directly teaching. It's kind of like the silent teacher that you're learning from the most.
With what you do now, where you help juniors and golfers at different levels,
Mhm.
and utilizing those things, how much does that differ from what, say, a sports psychologist does? I mean, you've alluded to, identifying it's, a swing issue can be a inflammation issue. That's a digestive issue. The
Mhm.
digestive goes to the mental. That part is obvious, but can you kind of give a brief synopsis or a breakdown between how you utilize those things versus what a sports psychologist is? Because you obviously at
Yeah,
the academy and when you were playing, you worked with a sports psychologist, and
absolutely.
you as well as anybody have the ability to have the dual perspective on the benefits and what one does maybe versus the other.
Yeah, so I would say that if you take, like, a personal trainer or your kind of like average golf coach, they understand the body, but they might not understand the mind, for example.
Mm-hmm.
A sports psychologist is very much oriented towards the mind, but might not understand, for example, how the body affects the mind. So let's take someone who's struggling more psychologically in competition. The sports psychologist might work with them on the level of mind, not realizing that they're having an issue managing their blood sugar, and that it's more like diet related that's causing a lot of their performance anxiety, because maybe they're eating too many processed carbohydrates and they're just on this blood sugar roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so that's one example. Number two is using the Chek system. I always start with what Paul calls the four doctors, or the six foundation principles, right? Diet, quiet, movement, and happiness, or the six foundation principles being nutrition, hydration, sleep, breathing, thinking, and movement. So, for example, if someone has a faulty breathing pattern and they're not breathing diaphragmatically, their faulty breathing pattern is going to keep them in a sympathetic fight or flight state in their nervous system. And anytime you're in that sympathetic fight or flight state, your mind is constantly in survival mode. So it's always going to be looking out for the negative, not the positive, because it's the negative things that are a threat to your survival. So your mind always has a negative bias when it's under stress. So the sports psychologist can work with that person and do a lot of like positive thinking. But if you don't shift that person's breathing pattern, that's a very steep uphill battle, because you're never going to shift that person's nervous system without fixing their faulty breathing pattern. And all of a sudden, you get them breathing through their nose and breathing from their belly. And now they're not having as many negative thoughts because their mind's not in survival mode anymore. So those are a few examples of where the sports psychologist might always go directly to the mind and the thoughts and the belief patterns and the programs, not realizing that it might be the breath or the diet that's driving that. So that's where obviously the holistic approach really allows you to see an individual, especially a golfer, from every angle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not so much specialized in one or segmented into one section.
Mm-hmm.
It's entire, as you mentioned earlier, the holistic is using the entirety, having a very good understanding of how the entirety works and how they're integrated together, and then identifying what part of that system needs to be adjusted so that the whole works at a higher level of efficiency.
Yeah. Yeah. It's every system affects every other system. There's no system in the body mind that works in isolation, you know, and you can even
Mm-hmm.
expand that out to the environment. You know, sometimes it's the environment that's causing an issue in the body and the mind. So you really don't even stop there. You actually have to look at the environment that the body or the person or the organism is in. You know, so I've had a lot of individuals that, had, performance anxiety or struggled with a lot of um, more psychological performance issues, and it was translating into poor performance, let's say in a specific sport. And if you look into it, you realize that they have some sort of mold issue in their environment. And the mold issue is creating a lot of toxicity in the body and a lot of sympathetic nervous system activity. And there's no way that you can get that person performing optimally if you don't clean up the environment. You could look at, someone's sleep quality. They might not be recovering from their training well enough because they're staying up at night with a lot of blue light being blasted with televisions and iPads and iPhones. And you realize that their sleep scores on their Aura Ring are not really ideal because they're they're not taking care of the lighting aspect of their sleep environment. So they're not recovering well enough, so they can't train, and they're now in pain, and they don't have the energy to put in the amount of practice that they need to. So now you need to look at their sleep hygiene. So it's just really, like you said, addressing every aspect of an individual and seeing how everything affects everything.
I was. It's funny you brought up a couple things on sleep and breathing. On the sleep side, I was listening to Peter Attia's The Drive.
Uh-huh.
I think it was a week or two ago, and he had a. I forget what the doctor was on there, but they were obviously talking about sleep and how to improve it, and they did bring up the getting on social media, let's say an hour before you go to bed, and
Mm-hmm.
the the thought that the blue light and everything else. And now he had a different take on it. He said, obviously, that's not a good thing to be looking at blue light. And I think that even iPhone has gone to settings on your phone that change the color of
Mm-hmm.
the light. Once you can set it to change based off when the sun goes down, which I've
Mm-hmm.
done. But he had the theory that it was more so that, as you mentioned, the stimulation of the brain, and that people are jumping from thing to thing and what's next. And if they're going from Facebook to Instagram, they're scrolling and they're trying to find the next hit of dopamine. That is wreaking in this doctor's God, what was his name? In his theory, that was causing more havoc than just having the light in somebody's face. And he said, obviously, that would take more study. That was just his theory from his years of practice and watching this thing, that the getting the mind bouncing around before you went to sleep was not a good thing, and regardless if
Mm-hmm.
it's a phone or if you're going out to doing something. The other one was the breathing that I found a couple years back through Dan Hellman when he had on Patrick McEwen and James Nestor. I think James wrote the book Breathe, and Patrick is what is his book called? And he's got the Institute. Uh,
Patrick.
James Patrick McEwen.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So Nestor was the investigative journalist. I think he spent time with Patrick McEwen. McEwen, I think, was a scientist on breathing and studied the
Mm-hmm.
nose and nasal patterns and the
Mm-hmm.
nasal cavity and all the things, and scientifically writes on it, and he teaches people about breathing. And then obviously Wim Hof is probably the most famous.
Mm-hmm.
And I know those guys have done, I think, quite a bit of work together.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very, that was just as I found those things, that just
Was
another
it the
avenue. That
oxygen advantage?
oxygen advantage, yes, that
Yeah.
was it.
Yeah.
That one was pretty interesting. And
Yeah.
I've been, I noticed my sleep improved when I was able to sleep without letting my mouth fall open at night, whether it was through
Mm-hmm.
tape or what have you. And I think I do a fairly good job of it now of keeping it close because,
Mm-hmm.
and I have noticed a difference. It's not like there's a drastic change for anybody out there who's saying, well, I'm going to take my mouth shut and I'm going to wake up tomorrow and I'm going to feel like Superman. It's not like it happens overnight. It might for some.
I've seen people cure their sleep apnea just with mouth taping.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've seen that before. So
And
it
it's
could
kind
have
of
a,
funny.
yeah.
It looks like a miniature bone, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The mouth tape, and
Mm-hmm.
people put it on their mouth, and then they just go ahead and go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
The first couple of nights that I slept with my mouth closed was uncomfortable, not
Mm-hmm.
drastically, but enough to when I woke up, I'm like, wait, something doesn't feel right. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if you roll over in the middle of the night and you say something's off,
Mm-hmm.
and I had to mentally prepare myself. Okay, just make sure it'll get better. Let's give it a few days and see how it comes out. Just the same way someone would do in their swing or their stroke. You know, you get a lesson. You're not going to be hitting it better than you ever have the next day.
Mm-hmm.
You need a couple days for that to all set in.
Sure.
Have you done much? I know you used to do the sauna quite a bit, and we talked about that in the pre-show. Have you done the ice baths much?
I haven't done as much the ice baths, but I do cold showers pretty regularly. Um, and up here in New York, in the New York area, the water can get pretty cold, especially in fall, winter, early spring. Like I've gotten the shower water to the point where if I need to shampoo that day, I'll get a little brain freeze.
Mm.
Um, where I might actually have to come in and out of it a little bit because of the brain freeze. It might take me a little longer, a couple of rounds to actually clear the shampoo out. So, yeah, I mean, I haven't done the ice baths, which I think is obviously a kind of another level of kind of immersion, but the cold showers here definitely kind of give me some of that kind of added benefit. And I usually do it after the infrared sauna. The cold is so much easier to do after the heat. Um, so it's a little bit harder for me to get myself to go into the cold without doing the heat first. Um, so I always like to warm myself up, and I usually do the infrared sauna for about a half hour at 150. That's just what my infrared sauna goes up to. And then I'll get in the cold shower after that. I usually do that. I usually do that a good 4 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And I found the
And how long do you stay in the shower then?
um, I would say like 2 to 4 minutes. So I mean, not crazy long, but long enough where I feel like my body temperature has come back down.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because I do it at night. I usually do the sauna at night, and obviously sleep quality is best when your body temperature is a little bit lower. So if I do the sauna and I get myself all heated up too close to bed, if I don't do cold afterwards, I find I'm overheated and I don't sleep as well.
Hmm.
Um, so I find the cold in the evening after the sauna brings my body temperature down enough where my deep sleep is a little bit better.
I've done both. I've got a 100-gallon feed container on the
Uh huh.
screened-in porch, and obviously, down here in the summertime, it's next to impossible to get that thing down cold enough. So
Yeah.
I'm going to get back into it as the weather's now. I mean, today I think was high as 78. So
Mm-hmm.
it takes roughly, if I remember right, about 30 to 50 pounds of ice to get it down to at least 50 to 55 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And I would do that usually about 10 minutes. And
Mm-hmm.
I know it's going to be a learning curve again. And my brother wants to do it now. And I've been telling him, as I told Hellman, because he just posted, I forget what the Italian guy is that he was doing a seminar with it. He's a breathing and I think movement and an ice bath sauna slash guy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but Dan did his first ice bath, and the guy coached him through it. But for me, and what I tell a lot of people is, one, if you're going to do it, starting your shower, and if you could imagine your shower as a clock, you know, start after you're done, start turning the dial, let's say 1 hour colder, and then
Mm-hmm.
let your body adjust. And so you're better off doing it that and gradually getting it as cold as you can than you are saying, well, I'm going to turn it all the way to cold and I'm going to force myself through it, because you're never going to get through,
Yeah.
to start. And then once you get to the point where you can handle the shower, and obviously, like you said, it's going to be colder in northern climates than it is in southern. Because when I went to the mountains last year and I had that, I couldn't get it halfway down. It was so cold.
Yeah.
Then you're ready to graduate to the ice bath. Because one of the things I found, once you're sitting in a tub of ice, it's that skin irritation is as bad as it. At first, it's worse than trying to deal with the cold. Your skin gets so
Yeah.
irritated. Um, but
What?
I tell you that the one thing I did that was, it was extremely hard mentally, but physically felt great afterwards. And this was one of the episodes I had when my back was really locked up. I did 10 minutes in 52 degrees, and I dried off, and I went up to the shower and did a 2-minute hot shower, and I cycled that 3 times. And by the end of the second cycle, I'm like, there's no way I can get through this third third time.
Mm-hmm.
And I did it, but I could almost feel the blood in my back just kind of flush out, like liquid
Mm-hmm.
plumber, liquid
Mm-hmm.
plumber for your back. And it
Mm-hmm.
did make a huge difference the next day.
Yeah. You know, I think a lot of people are aware of like the physiological benefits of the sauna and the cold, but one thing I share with a lot of people is the benefit that's often overlooked is more of the element of every time you're about to do the sauna or the cold plunge, there's a part of you that's trying to talk you out of it. Why it's a
Mm-hmm.
terrible idea, and there's this part of you that always wants to keep you safe and comfortable. But developing the skill and the ability to override that signal and do something that's uncomfortable in the moment, but you know that the benefit and the return on the investment is really great and in your favor, is one of the most important skills to develop just in life. And it translates into other areas of your life when you just like you strengthen that ability to step into discomfort and stay centered in yourself while you're in something uncomfortable. And that might be, hold on, I think we froze.
You're good. It'll keep going.
Okay. Um, no, I saw the time had stopped for a second. Um, that might be like a difficult conversation with your spouse or giving a work presentation that you're nervous about. Like if you've practiced every day just microdosing discomfort, it makes
Mm-hmm.
all of those other things in your life that are uncomfortable that you are being called to engage in a little bit easier. So I think that's one of the biggest benefits that is often overlooked.
I've even gone so far because if I remember right, Dan had told me when he was over in France working with Guy Boyer
Uh-huh.
that that's kind of when he got bigger or got Guy was showing him a lot of things about sauna and the
Mm-hmm.
benefits and everything else. And he said one of the things, I think it was where he said, they got in and they were in for a minute or so, and he was going to ask Guy some questions, and Guy just like, not right now. Like that was Guy's time to
Mm-hmm.
meditate, to just calm down, just put everything, just turn his brain off for a while and just completely relax. And I've been doing that as well, and I've noticed a difference when I sleep at
Mm-hmm.
night. It's just like so. And what reminded me, as you said, as you do these things, and it develops the ability as you microdose being uncomfortable during the day. If you can start to be uncomfortable and then calm your mind down in that setting, just
Mm-hmm.
by breathing and disregarding any thoughts that are popping up in your head, because I
Mm-hmm.
mean, as we alluded to earlier, in today's nonstop world, as you're trying to sleep, I've told people this: if you go through an entire day, let's say 16, 18-hour day, and you've constantly got shit popping up in your head, it
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't just shut itself off when you go to sleep.
Right.
Your brain cycles through that, and if that popping up is strong enough, it's going to pop up in your head enough while you're sleeping. It's going to wake you up. Um, so I've gone to not just making myself uncomfortable getting in a sauna, but okay, let me shut this brain off
Mm-hmm.
until I can't do it anymore, and then I don't fight it. I just okay, if I hit 5 minutes this time, let me see if by 2 weeks from now I can get to 7 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
and just grow it from there. But you notice the differences, small incremental differences.
Absolutely.
Being in the uh, realm, so to speak, that you were in, you spent a lot of time in the Gulf, and you spent a lot of time in the holistic, and your dad is a Western medicine. He's been in there. What do you see as far as those fields as they relate to sports as maybe being the next thing as technology advances everything? And because it usually comes from the periphery, as from what I've
Mm-hmm.
found. It doesn't come from, because everybody on the inside is kind of focused on what they're doing, and on the outside they're like, okay, how can we make this better? What do
Mm-hmm.
you see as far as something that's being developed, or maybe just as a conglomeration of some things that people put together, and it really makes a big change?
Well, I'm not really big into like the biohacking world. Um,
Like
so
the Ben Greenfield stuff?
yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued by some of it, but I don't really take a deep dive into all of those kind of like devices and hacks and things like that. So I can't really speak in terms of like new cutting edge technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I do think that I mean, I'll tell you one thing. I think psychedelics are a huge asset, and the growing evidence of the incredible potential healing effects um, on the mind, on the body, on trauma, and how that can really translate into performance. Like if you listen to like Aaron Rodgers, who was just on Rogan talking about
Mm-hmm.
like his use of ayahuasca being what he contributes to his back-to-back MVP seasons, and just how it just put him in this totally different state, and his ability to perform was just incredible after doing a lot of the plant medicine work. So I do think psychedelics are on the rise in a positive way. I just think it really has to be used intelligently, because there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of shit out there in terms of people misusing it and um, really doing a lot of harm. So if that's used intelligently, I think that's kind of on the cutting edge of a lot in terms of healing, but also performance at the same time. Um, I think a lot of like Joe Dispenza's work and a lot of the work around the power of meditation and breath and mindfulness. I think a lot of the research coming out of, and a lot of this honestly is the stuff that our ancestors and indigenous people have been doing for thousands of years that we now are starting to see the scientific research to back it up. I think a lot of the major stuff that's going to be on the forefront is stuff that we're reclaiming from the past. It's
Mm-hmm.
not actually new technology that's being invented. It's our modern day science validating the indigenous technology that always was there, but we kind of like, overlooked it because we thought it was either voodoo or, bullshit. So I think that's a big thing. And also, one thing that I just tell a lot of people who are always like looking for that next thing is, and I really kind of respect Paul in this regard, is the power of the basics, the power of simplicity. And our culture is addicted to complexity. It's always addicted to like the next new thing. And there's very much like an overlooking of like diet, sleep, movement, grounding, um, getting out in nature, turning your devices off for enough time during the day for you to kind of reset your nervous system, and just like real basic, simple self care and doing the basics well, um, and grounding yourself in the basics. I think that's also not to be overlooked. Um, so those are a couple areas that I think are really important, and it's not like a sexy answer in terms of like this amazing new technology that I think is going to change everything. I think we're just bringing a lot from the past back into the present and really validating it with new research. Um, so it's really reclaiming what's always been there.
That's interesting because Scott Fawcett from Decade Golf was on, and we were talking about course management, which is his. That's what his system is, and I think almost I forget he said 50 or 60 tour pros are using it. Zalatoris and DeChambeau are his two most notable
Are
guys
you
that
using
use it,
what?
and it's called Decade. It's a golf
Okay.
course management system. So
Okay.
basically, Scott says, look, if your natural tendency off the tee is to hit a fade, then just hit the fade. Just play it every single time. Obviously, a hole like 13 at Augusta is going to be an outlier that you have to draw it around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
You can't hit a fade there. But he's like, don't mess around because if you're just gonna do more damage to your game. The other one is that he found out, and he's an electrician slash mathematician by education,
Mm-hmm.
is that they found out that eliminating high numbers is going to be much better than trying to make more birdies.
Mm-hmm.
The data just shows that. And then the other thing is he has a formula more or less for where to aim at the green. So it takes out the emotional concept. It's like, so if you're say you're a tour pro or a scratch golfer and you're 150 yards from the green, if the pin is 3 feet off the left edge. So Scott's formula is your aim point from the 150 yards and has nothing to do with angles. It's just you take 5% of that and you take that distance from the edge of the green that the pin is on, left or right, and then you
Mm-hmm.
come in that far. So if you're 150 yards, 10% is 15, so 7.5 yards. The pin's tucked left 3 feet. You're going to aim 7.5 feet or off the left edge, or I'm sorry, 7.5 yards. So you're going to aim, what is it? Four. If the pin's off 3 off the edge, you're going to aim 4.5 yards right of the pin. It's
Mm-hmm.
basically that simple.
Mm-hmm.
So and it instead of like these guys, I remember when I used to play, and I'm sure you ran into enough of them. They're sitting there spending hours on their flop shot, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like, well, why are you doing this? Well, they tuck the pins in the final round, so you're going to fire more pins. You're going to miss more short side. It's like, okay, but you're bringing in bogey or double bogey in that situation. Just hit it 15 feet, and you're going to have more opportunity. You have a greater chance at making birdie, and
Mm-hmm.
no worse than par.
Mm-hmm.
So things like that, where some coaches or someone might come out with, as we said, a new system, and these
Yeah.
golfers are going to say, "Oh, I got to do this," and it's just the simplest of things.
Yeah.
That it's like, do these simple things, and you'll be just fine, and do
Yeah.
them very well.
Also, when it comes to the data collection, one area that I think has been growing recently that is really, really important is, if you take like the Aura Ring or you take the Whoop or all these
Hey, I got the Garmin on right
devices.
now.
Uh-huh. Yeah, all these devices that track like heart rate variability, um, sleep, um, body temperature, resting heart rate, all of these different metrics. What you start to realize is the old way of training was that more was always better,
Hmm.
and pushing yourself more was always going to give you better results. But as Paul Chek says, you don't get stronger when you're training, you get stronger when you're resting. And the rest and recovery has been very overlooked because everyone always worshipped hard work. And being the hardest worker in the room was going to be how you were going to beat everyone and get the most amount of results, whether it was in the gym, on the golf course. But now you have athletes waking up with an Aura ring and seeing their heart rate variability very low and their resting heart rate a little bit elevated. And they look at the training they were supposed to do that day, and now they have to dial it back because they can see the state of their nervous system. Where if they actually did their full workout that day, they would be digging themselves a deeper hole, leading to injury, leading to illness,
Hmm.
fatigue. And this is why Paul also always says that the slightly undertrained athlete will always beat the overtrained athlete. And the reason for that is exactly what an Aura ring shows, or a Whoop shows, or all of these devices of when your nervous system is in that sympathetic state and you keep pushing yourself, you're creating so much stress and inflammation in the system that your ability to actually perform at a high level starts to go down the more work you keep putting into it. So I think a lot of the technology has started to reclaim the essential value of rest and recovery, which I think traditionally was often overlooked. Um, so I think that's a big area as well.
Yeah, I agree that the ability to know when to back off and then
Mm-hmm.
when you can press the accelerator, because
Mm-hmm.
as we talked about early in the beginning, that trying to throttle it down when you're already running in the red is only going to blow an engine. And I
Mm-hmm.
see that a lot with golfers who I've coached or played, or other golfers I played with. Usually from collegiate to turning pro, they try to slam on the accelerator because
Mm-hmm.
now they're going from playing, what is it, 7 tournaments in the fall, 6 7 tournaments in the spring in a collegiate schedule, to now they're playing 3 4 weeks straight on a smaller tour, satellite tour, Corn Ferry, Mondays, uh, even on the big tour. And now they just like they think they have to, in order to play their best, they have to push themselves so hard, because
Yeah.
that's kind of how they did it in college. They're only playing 6 weeks, so they learn how to push, but they don't learn how to take their time and plod along. It's a completely different animal,
Yeah. I
and there is a
wonder.
learning curve for that.
I wonder if you look at like because a lot of the I'm sure the rookies out there that kind of want to get inside like the money list. They need to
Hmm.
make a certain amount of money to keep their card. A lot of them will kind of revert to like playing as many events as they possibly can as a way of trying to make that amount of money. But I wonder if the quality of the play increases when you start to dial back the frequency. And I wonder if those guys will actually make more money by playing less and taking the time to recover and be kind of in full gear for each event. Kind of like, you know, someone lifting weights 7 days a week might not actually get stronger and more gains than someone who's lifting 3 times a week,
Right.
you know? So yeah, I wonder, there's kind of like that paradox of less is more. And I think that's been rejected for so long, but there's now like data showing that yes, less is more, in many different ways.
That's why I have said for many years that it's the recipe that is so important. That understanding when to apply yourself and at what rate, capacity, whatever you're doing, is
Mm-hmm.
more important than just applying yourself at 100% or
Mm-hmm.
110%. That I think that is the skill set that maybe is lacking. I know in the golf world, and our friend Rushton Matthew, uh, when he was at Notre Dame, here's a kid that's playing 6 7 days a week while he's at school,
Mm-hmm.
junior senior year, and he's seasoned. He's had a couple years of Division I golf under his belt. They're in the ACC, highly competitive, and he would come home, and I was playing once a week, and I'd beat him, and
Mm-hmm.
I'd give him a hard time, but then on the way home, I'd tell him, look, you just haven't learned yet when to press the accelerator, when to let it go, when to brake, when not to brake. I said,
Mm-hmm.
I have. I said, you will learn that. And now I know he would probably beat my brains in if we went on play because he's had 6 years of playing the professional level and he's had to learn how to do that and he's done a very good job of it.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a skill that is I don't know if somebody can. Well, I guess they could learn it when they're high school age, college age, if they start at a younger age and they get to that point. But at some point in someone's development, they have to learn that, whether it's in golf or in business or in life, you got to start backing off at some point, or else you're just going to burn yourself out.
Well, it's a lot of emotional intelligence, and there's also an aspect of learning delayed gratification. We live in this world of instant gratification with our devices, social media, Amazon Prime. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's so much instant gratification that, for example, like I might have this huge like urge to work out today and this desire to work out today, but I know looking at my Aura ring or just checking my resting heart rate, like, or just feeling my body, I know I'm not like fully recovered from yesterday's workout. So there's a part of me that knows that if I wait to work out tomorrow, my lifts are going to be so much better. But if I'm still in that part of my ego that's still very attached to instant gratification, I might actually go into the gym today because I don't have the emotional intelligence to postpone that gratification to tomorrow where I know my performance is going to be better. So I think there's even just like this cultural pathology of instant gratification that people have a hard time just dialing it back and waiting for that next moment that it's going to be more beneficial for them to kind of put the foot on the gas.
It sometimes people miss the simplest things. If you've ever watched, for anyone that's ever been to a golf tournament, a major in particular, let's say a U.S. Open or Masters, because I think you went up to the Masters a couple of
Mm-hmm.
times, didn't you, for the practice rounds
Yeah, we
when you
went
were
a
here?
couple of
So,
times.
right, I used to pay attention to Tiger, and Tiger's known to play 9 holes on, let's say Monday, the opposite 9 on Tuesday, and then he gets up early, goes to the range, and dials in some things Wednesday, and he shuts it down each day. He
Mm-hmm.
knows that the next 4 days are going to be some of the most grueling of the year, 4 times a year at
Mm-hmm.
least. And he does all his homework well in advance. And when he gets there, he puts it in rest mode because he knows come Thursday morning, that first tee ball, game's on. And no matter how hard you try, your brain's not going to be able to shut off in the evening. So all these other guys are out there beating balls, beating balls, beating balls, and trying to fix things. It's like, why? I mean, just watch what he does. He's the best at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't understand why people go the other direction, but maybe it's just right under their nose and they don't even see it.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychology to it. I mean, you know, and that's where a lot of golf is actually an opportunity to grow spiritually too. Golf I would say is the number, I mean, I'm probably biased, but the number one sport or activity for spiritual growth. Like the
Mm-hmm.
amounts that the game of golf has taught me, that just applies to life in general is incredible. And I honestly think that's why I chose golf. Like from a very young age, was there were a lot of lessons that needed to be learned, that golf for me was just the delivery mechanism for those lessons.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that everybody talk about that frustrates the shit out of most other athletes in particular that go to golf because in other sports, if you try harder, you usually do better.
Mm-hmm.
In golf, if you try harder, you usually do worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And very very similar to life. Not always when you try harder does it always. I mean, you might do it in the short term, a week, a
Mm-hmm.
month. You could, a year maybe, but you try harder. But eventually, you're gonna do some damage to yourself emotionally, physically. Take your pick.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of like Buddhism and a lot of like the Zen teachings. And
Hmm.
if you read those teachings, they're all about the paradox. Everything's a paradox. And if you look at the game of golf, exactly what you just said is, you know, like the Zen teachers talk about like effort through non-effort, action through non-action, and how you really gain more control by letting go. And you realize that the real teachings in the game of golf are the paradoxes of life. It's also a lot about like letting go of your attachments to outcome,
Hmm.
because in golf you don't have control over anything. Like once that golf ball leaves the golf club, like you could get a gust of wind, you could, there's so many factors and variables that are outside of your control that you have to be able to stay within yourself and let go of your attachment to outcome or the need to try and control everything, because you realize that you don't have control over most of it. And the only thing you really have control over is your response to the results,
Hmm.
how you choose to experience it.
Being more worldly in your education and what you've done, because I had this discussion a little bit with John Dunnigan the other day, and I'd
Mm-hmm.
like to talk to some sports psychologists about it. Is if you look at, let's say, the British Open, where there's always wind, and there's always, he's got all these mounds all over the place, and the greens are bigger, and the ball runs more, and it's harder, and everything else. Is there less of a psychological component that people get frustrated playing that type of golf versus the target type of golf in the U.S., where you're expected to hit it down a tree line fairway, and everything's softer, and it lands where it stops where it lands, and if
Yeah.
you don't match that, then you've done something wrong. Where the other way is, okay, you could hit a perfect shot and it hits the wrong, takes the wrong bounce, and now you're buried in the face of a bunker. It's like, okay, there's nothing I can do about it.
This is why they always say, like, watch out for the injured athlete. This is also why some of my best rounds of golf and best tournament performances were in bad weather. I would say some of the best rounds of golf I ever played was either I was hurting in some way, like
Mm-hmm.
something was hurting, or they were really bad conditions. And the reason for that is if you have an injury or there's bad conditions, there's less expectations. And when there's less expectations, you actually free yourself up because there's less fear. There's less fear of not meeting those expectations, so you actually free up your performance. So I always
Makes a lot of
felt the
sense.
most free in bad weather. I always felt the most free if something was bothering me, because I didn't feel that added weight of expectation, and you experience more freedom within that. I think that's probably kind of the root of kind of what you were saying in terms of the difference between the two, playing overseas or playing here. I think it's a lot related to expectation.
Yeah, it's probably why I always played better in the match play. I think I won it once or twice and lost it the one year. I was a real physical wreck, and no matter
Mm-hmm.
what I did, I wasn't going to overcome that. But I noticed that when I played, and I kind of came up with a very similar uh, self-examination. Say, well, you're shutting off your brain, and that you don't have the expectation that you're playing a different way. You're not constantly hold a hold a hold, letting it build and build and build to eventually where I snap, or
Yeah.
just it just shuts itself down. Because if I look back at my years playing, I'd have two or three good rounds and then a bad round, and then
Mm-hmm.
a couple more, maybe the bad, depending on how tired I was, as we're talking about wearing yourself out. Because I'd come home and I'd say, I got to practice 10 hours a day, and then I go back on the road. That didn't do me any good.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they found it on some tests. They found out when Health South was, before they did all their embezzlement and all got into their shitstorm, but they had a gym in Beaufort, and there was a psychologist in there that at the time the Olympics was in Atlanta, and a couple of his buddies sent him a device that they used with the Olympians in Colorado to track who could get themselves into the zone. And they,
Mm-hmm.
because I was a athlete, pro athlete, so to speak, back then, they asked me to do it. So I did. I maxed out the zone. He goes, you're as high as the Olympians, as any Olympian that we have. You're in the
Mm-hmm.
99.9 percentile. He goes, now we're going to test you on how well you can come out of it. And I thought I killed it. And he goes, no, you realize we were supposed to do it that time. I said, yeah, I did. He goes, no, you didn't. He said,
Mm-hmm.
you didn't come out of it at all. So my brain would not let go, calm down. It was constantly going till eventually it just shut itself off. And that's when I
Mm-hmm.
play like shit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder. I wonder if you tracked people's scoring average in match play, if it's if it's significantly lower than stroke play because they're not actually keeping score. I wonder if that's ever been looked at.
I don't know in the WGC. I would have to think that they could do that because it's over the course of I think 5 days or four.
Mm-hmm.
You're playing matches, but in like the Ryder Cup, I think that they get setting it up for TV, and some of those guys like I remember particularly when it was at Minnesota at Hazeltine last time, they kind of set it up for the home team gets to set it up the course how they want to, and I think the U.S. set it up to make birdies so that it was harder for the U.S. Or Europeans to catch them. But I think Sergio was like made 7 or 8 birdies, and Mickelson made like 9 that round, and
Mm-hmm.
so something like that where match play is consistent year after year at the same event might be harder because the course setup's becoming different. But at
Mm-hmm.
a WGC event or something, when they used to have the one in Europe, I think it was at Wentworth. That would be very interesting study. Maybe they have it. I'd be curious to find out if maybe Lou Stagner might know something about that stuff. I'll have to ask him when he
Mm-hmm.
comes on in a couple months.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I'd like to know that myself.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You got time for a few rapid fire and then get out of here?
Sure.
You call it after you call it the emergency 9 because it's 9 questions,
Uh huh.
just to end and wind down. So President's Cup this week. If you were playing in it and you had your walk up song to the first hole. What do you have in play?
Hmm. I used to always play "Lose Yourself" by Eminem before I would go play tournaments. So I would just have to go back to that.
Okay. You could caddy for anybody playing in today's world, men, women, Europe, here, Australia, anywhere, anyone you wanted to,
Professional?
anywhere. And well, it could be that, or it could be anybody you wanted to that plays golf.
Um, hmm. I would really like to caddy for Justin Thomas. I'm really fascinated by. I feel like his shot making abilities are very unique. I think he's a very rare talent. I would really like to caddy for him. Now, if Tiger was like in his prime, like if I would say Tiger, obviously, but that's like an easy answer. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I would like to caddy for Justin Thomas. I think he's an incredible talent.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. He works the ball in today's world as much as anybody outside of, let's say, Tiger or Bubba Watson. I
Yeah,
would say JT is not afraid, as we talked about being taking the reins off and have the comfort in that high level. I would say he's got to be way up there as
yeah,
far
his
as
shot
top
making
out there in today's.
is really incredible.
All right, let's see. You walk into a casino. What's the first game you're playing?
Blackjack,
Smart answer.
easy, easy.
Odds are in your favor. Rather live 100 years in the past or 100 years in the future?
Ooh, right about now, 100 years in the future is scary. So,
No kidding.
With some of the stuff that's going on in the world right now, I'm gonna go backwards.
Yeah,
I'm
the
going
Roaring
100.
Twenties probably wouldn't be a bad time.
Yeah, I'm going 100 years in the past for sure.
All right. Most used app on your phone.
Spotify. That's where I listen to podcasts.
Mine, probably mine too.
Yeah.
If you could play with any celebrity, who would it be?
Ooh. If I could play with any celebrity, Matthew McConaughey.
He comes to mind for me too. We still
He's
share a
such a.
lot of the
I think
same.
he's such a cool guy. He sounds like one of the
Interesting.
most fascinating people, and he seems like he's a good golfer.
You know, the one thing that I when I really found him to be fascinating was he did something that I always want to do. Is once he started doing really well in his career, made
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit of money. And this was before he was married. He he got a like a big dually truck, and he got a big camper that he pulled on it, and a dog, and he would just drive all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And he told his agent, if you need me, call me, and whatever city I'm closest to, I'll drive there and we can meet and discuss whatever we need to discuss. But I thought
Mm-hmm.
that was really cool.
Yeah,
Just get up,
he's a cool
get your
cat.
dog and go.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to play golf
Spe-
with him.
yeah, I mean, the guy that plays bongos naked, drunk and high in his front yard, that guy's pretty cool and pretty good in my book.
Yep.
A couple more. Movie about your life. Who are they going to cast to play Greg?
Bradley Cooper.
That one's obvious.
Just because I've been told there's some resemblance.
I would agree. Let's see. Someone put $1 million in your bank account and gave you a ticket anywhere you want to go in the world. Where are you going to
Mm-hmm.
go?
Well, if we're keeping this golf related, if I had $1 million and was able to get onto Augusta National, I would do anything. Not anything, but I would pay a lot of money and do anything to play Augusta National. So if we're keeping this golf related, I would get my ass to Augusta as quickly as possible.
Cool. And then the last one, this one everybody gets. In your opinion, as far as golfers, who's the goat? Who's greatest of all time?
Tiger. I mean, I I think nobody's played golf at the level that Tiger has. Like,
Hmm.
sure, you could look at numbers and say like Jack's won more majors, but if you look at the greatest golf that's ever been played, I don't think anyone's played a higher level of golf than Tiger.
I agree.
So that's an easy one for me, at least.
All right, what do you have coming up? Anything where people can go hear you talking? You got something you've been working on? Anything on website related, or
Yeah,
tell
so
people
if
where they can?
my home base is healing4d.com. So if they go to healing4d.com, they could find my one-on-one coaching practice, a lot of like online workshops and webinars that I've done, a lot of
Hmm.
other podcast guest appearances, and I'll put this will be up on my site as well. Um, I have an online program called Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness. So it's a lot of what we talked about today, kind of in the world of mental health, which can obviously be very important for a lot of golfers out there. So if anyone's interested in that, they can go to healing4d.com/HTM. And that's where they
Hmm.
can find it's a 21-day online program that I built a couple of years back. So those are the two best places to find me. In terms of social media, I'm on Instagram 4D Healing. It's kind of the only social media that I hang out on. So those would be the best places to get in touch with me.
And I'll have all those as always in the summary with direct links to all those sites for everybody listening. Greg, it's been a pleasure. It's been awesome to catch up. I've been able to watch from as you went on your journey and
Mm-hmm.
had a front row seat to a lot of it. And it's been fun watching your growth. I'm proud of you.
Yeah,
Doing a lot of
thank
great
you.
things.
And thanks for having me. anytime I can hang out with you, I'm always going to take up that opportunity.
All right, awesome.